Lovely to see you all. Thanks so much for coming along. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. And welcome to our seventh Computing Education Research Seminar of 2026, hosted by the Raspberry Pi Foundation. I'm Bobby White. I think I've met quite a lot of you on this call, and I'll be chairing today's session. As you know, in our seminars this year, we've been focusing on applied AI. So we've been looking at research that examines how we can teach and learn about AI across the curriculum. But instead of focusing on research just in computer science education, which is our bread and butter, we're looking at research across the disciplines and the humanities and the arts and the sciences. So really looking outside our usual camp. Today, though, we are very, very excited to welcome Dan Verständig from Goethe University in Frankfurt as our speaker today. And we're very much looking forward to his presentation on co-constructing critique, social explainable AI, and critical computational literacy. I'm very pleased to introduce today's speaker, Dan Verständig. To give a bit of a bio, Dan is Professor of Educational Theory and Practices of Critical Computational Literacy at the Center for Critical Computational Studies at Goethe Institute University, Frankfurt. His research addresses learning in the context of digitality with a focus on inequality, civic participation, and creative critical approaches to coding and data literacy. In his seminar today, Dan will connect current discussions around social explainable AI with critical computational literacy. This approach encourages learners to see digital tools not as inevitable, but as shaped by human values, cultures, and histories. In the face of planetary and post-digital challenges, critical computation literacy aims to help people read these systems critically, imagine alternatives, and participate responsibly in shaping the futures they make possible. We are very excited to have Dan with us today to talk about this interesting and important topic. Over to you, Dan.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much, Bobby, for that nice introduction. I'm so happy to be here and to accompany you for the next 3 hours on my talk about social XAI and critical computational literacy. And I hope we make it kind of interactive, no worries. I hope we can walk through these 45 minutes quite fluently. And I try to bridge the gap between kind of research and also practice in a very specific sense, because I'm really interested in how the digital transformation is going on in educational contexts, in several educational contexts. And I'm coming today with some slides that I want to share with you. And I just want to open up discussions with you today. So I bring in just a few topics, and I hope we have this fruitful discussion afterwards. Right now, I was kind of really excited to come up with the combination of two basic topics in general that are linked to critique. So, for example, social XAI is a very specific topic in the explainability discussion right now, and critical computational literacy is also something I want to propose to talk about with you, and I just want to kind of bring in some ideas on how to conceptualize literacy in the age of digitality, or in the computational age, kind of. So before we talk about artificial intelligence, it might be useful, since I'm educational scientist right now, I'm working in an interdisciplinary center, but I'm still at heart an educational scientist, to ask a much older question. And the question is simply why? And this is not only simply why, because I'm asking this myself quite often these days, being overwhelmed by technology in different contexts, but also to just basically remind us about the idea that the question why is a very simple and, how to say, complex construct in the idea of educational processes and also in educational science. It is probably one of the first questions we learn to ask. Children ask it relentlessly, and sometimes to understand the world, sometimes to get cookies, sometimes to simply try get over some explanations. And these questions are very simple, very basic. For example, why is the sky blue? Why do waves reach the shore? Or why can't I touch the stove? These questions are maybe common. These questions are kind of, how to say, part of our daily life, and we oversee some of them maybe on a regular basis, and we answer them always. I hope so. But sometimes I ask myself, why is this happening to me sometimes? And when we wipe code, for example, maybe you worked with Anthropic's Claude, you might also ask, who is Jason, for example, or how to access the local host, maybe. Maybe you came across these memes recently. I was just yesterday stumbling upon these memes, and it's quite funny to see. But in general, this is the whole, how to say, foundation of starting an explanation. And this is my entry to the talk today. I just want to talk about explainability, explanations, and the sociability about explanations. I mean, explanations are always social, but when it comes to technical infrastructures, to computational methods and computational systems, we often see right now in these days that technology is driving progress. It's changing the way we explain things, and it's changing the way we receive the world in a very specific sense, and we perceive the world through mediated communication and through digital technologies. And education in many ways begins with a question. It must not be why or who or what, but it's a question. And this question provokes us to answer maybe correctly, but simply try to explain the world in a very specific sense. Because asking why changes our relationship to the world in a very specific sense. When we talk about explainability or explanations, especially when it comes to large language systems, we face the idea that we are often asked to get into or to jump into a very specific context and try to find an information. And this information is giving us a very specific context again, and that it's basically answering things. And what I started when preparing the talk was basically asking, when I'm working with large language models or with AI-based systems, to ask, after I got a prompt output, why? And I did it once, twice, and several times. And what was kind of, I can't even say fascinating, it's kind of frustrating. It's always a different explanation. Of course, it's a statistical approximation, and it is coming towards the context. And it is shaped by the input as well. So this is maybe not so beneficial to do so. And as you can see, I had a lot of time to prepare this talk, considering asking the systems, why are they responding this way? And I know this is something people are doing right now in the daily life practices. And people are trying to understand the world through the given technologies. And this is something which is, again, crucial because responsibility comes with it in a very specific sense. I will talk about later what I mean with that. And it is also kind of, in that sense, very fascinating because we generate explanations here in a very dialogical idea. And this dialogical idea is not even a conversation with a colleague, it's a conversation with a statistical amount of data that is kind of giving me this simulation and the idea of being in a conversation and getting to understand the world in a very specific sense. It's not even about the technology, it's rather about the social situationness and the situated experience I discuss here. And what I'm kind of interested in, and what our research group and also bigger research contexts are interested in, is the question who decides when an explanation is good enough for specific contexts again, and who is able to explain something to another person or to another system, for example. So what is a sufficient explanation for a very complex and opaque system? And how can the system even explain itself in a very specific sense? And these questions are coming up. And before we jump into that technological or social technological configurations, I just wanted to ask you, since we are here in that Zoom session all together, and I really love to see how you introduced yourself coming from across the countries, and this is very, very enriching right now. I want to ask you simply, just briefly send me a sentence into the chat or a short comment, a brief comment, what you see on this slide right now. Interesting. An optical illusion, also interesting. The coastline. Many of you are focusing on the coastline. That's interesting. And the small person. Where's the yeah, you see the small person. Actually, yes. And there's another one, actually exactly on the bottom line at the coastline. totally forgot about that. To be honest, the left person standing next to the backpack, next to the point of the question mark, that's actually me taking the picture with the drone. And it has been captured at Montara Beach. And I can specify the context because Montara Beach or Montara State Beach is in California. And the picture has been taken on April 25th in 2024, exactly 7 minutes past 4 p.m. So it was a cloudy day, it was a grayish day, but the water was really amazing to see and it was quite calm. And this is kind of shaping the context right now. It's not only image you see also maybe on pixels or on other stock footage image. I actually got inspired by these and I wanted to go there and want to take a kind of stock footage to take it with presentations later on the next years. That's what I did. It's also contextualizing senses and what you see and what you feel. And also it's up to your prior knowledge to some degree. I mean, this is a very interpretive process. It is quite simple, but let's get a step further. Let's take it to another step. And I have to focus on this. Imagine now that you are a climate researcher, a surfer, or maybe an artist. Would you explain the image the same? Would you explain what you see in the same words with the same contextualization? Or would you rather differ? If you would just drop me one word, it would be great. What would you basically change? What could you see? This is something crucial for explainability and explanations in general, because they are not static processes. They are being generated in social practices, in social contexts, and they are dependent. What you see and what I perceive might be fully different. Your green might be not my green at all. And what we see and what we perceive needs to be objectified in a very specific sense through technology and mediated communication. And this is not so easy as we think almost, but it will be even more complicated when we think about moral decision making and ethical implications of these explanations that are arising and the systems and the data that is flowing through these systems. So basically, explanations are for someone, for some purpose, in some context. And this is something very crucial. I mean, in the domain of explainability research and explainable AI research, this is the first proposal at all. And it's not only about transparency and responsibility, it's for a specific context and a specific situation. Now we have AI technologies that are in general, or we can also speak about generative AI, that are kind of universal, that are kind of adaptable to different contexts, and they can shift context in its own model and with different data sets. So this is something very specific. And when we think about education today, we often talk about competencies and computational thinking. And what we focus is to make people understand and make people experience how these implementations are going to work. And this is something that is absolutely crucial, and this is very important. And I think it will become even more important to very specific ideas. And since we are working here fully interdisciplinary, next to me there is a climate researcher, Nico, sitting there working on climate modeling. I think these planetary transformations we are facing right now are affording or asking us to change our perspectives on disciplines and also on the computational in general, because we also need to understand how philosophical thoughts being implemented and how philosophy of AI can be utilized in a very specific sense. I mean, I'm sorry, I'm not a philosopher, but this is a very crucial topic. I will talk about later what I mean by that. But when I focus on the discussion that is going on, especially in computing education, but also rather in general educational science, we talk a lot about, at least in Western societies, about AI literacy, data literacy, or even media literacy. It's still a thing. And there seems to be no shortage of literacies at all. And as you know, I'm coming also up with a critical computation literacy. So I have something as a concept of literacy with me again. But following ongoing discourses in the philosophy of education, it could be beneficial that our fascination with competencies makes us kind of, or it could be not beneficial to look towards different directions. That's what I wanted to say. Our fascination with competencies makes us overlook something much more fundamental: the world we're living in and the orientation we are gaining. And this cannot only be measured by competencies and fulfilled by the idea of being certain to some degree. It also has to incorporate in that equation the idea of being in the world and being okay, having routines, but knowing that we have to evade routines, that we have to reconfigure our habits, that we have to reconfigure our routines from day one to day two, maybe, and in a very specific occasion. So this is kind of an idea from modernity that comes up with flexibility. And there's a very negative connotation to it when we think about workspace situations and the idea of flexibility, because it basically has kind of a neoliberal idea that we just need to be flexible to get the opportunity to be successful in a very specific sense. But it kind of is entangled with the whole idea of technologies and educational technologies and the upcoming trends towards education. When we think of structural change, is always focusing on individual action taking and responsibilities. And therefore, we need to kind of discover the constraints that are ongoing when it comes to educational change, but also when it comes to societal change and impacts then educational infrastructures. It has always been organized around attempts to make the world understandable. So when we talk about competencies and education, we kind of see that we also want to improve computational systems to make up a better understanding of the world, to understand how climate changes are affecting us, to understand and calculate and predict how we are kind of living in a world and how we can make the world to something better. And there we have a very humanistic idea behind of this. And this is kind of driving rhetorics about the technological development in a very specific sense. However, this is not going to work out every day and every time. And it's, of course, not working for the global situation, holistically speaking. It's working for a very privileged and particular amount of people in a very specific region in the world. And it's kind of not benefiting all of us right now. But human beings still learn from the beginning on through explanations. So therefore, this entanglement of explainable AI and planetary transformations, this entanglement is really crucial. And I think this is something that has to be considered with a social dimension. I will talk about it in a second, but what I basically mean is that basically parents explain storms to their children, communities explain death or they deny it to, priests explain suffering, and scientists explain nature. This is how we understand the world in a very specific sense. And of course, friends kind of describe or explain misunderstandings. So therefore, they are friends. And one of the cruelest notion and oldest educational technologies, so to say, is the idea of humanity in education and the vice versa reaction of education into humanities in that sense. And they purely make action possible, the explanations. So without explanations, we are kind of trapped in a kind of nimbus of not be actionable. However, there is a paradox, an educational paradox. An explanation does not serve or does not be a promise of being right. So I can give you an explanation of something and it doesn't help you at all. So we are faced in that situation. And there it comes where pedagogy is really interesting, because as a pedagogical action and in the context of explanation, you might give something as a pathway or a hint, but it doesn't basically need to be this something that needs to be transported. It's basically also connected to the idea of communication. Communication is basically following a sociologist, not always possible. It can also be impossible. However, one is communicating something and one is receiving something. And this is changing in the process of explanation. And when you work basically with AI systems, large language models, you see that this is implemented by design in the dialogical interfaces, that the role of the explainee and explainer is shifting. And therefore, the social dynamic that is coming up is also shifting the explanandum to some degree, because you start with a specific topic, you want to create a specific project, want to get a specific outcome. And then in the thread of the communication, of the conversation, of the prompting or looping, it becomes a changing project, a moving target, kind of. So this is a very interactive dynamic, and this is very kind of private, and it's into our intimate sphere in a very specific sense, because it is the conversation of us with the data in that thread, in that AI system thread. And it is not the public discussion, but it could be public, since we are working on private industrialized infrastructures, but the data could be recontextualized. So therefore, the basic idea of explanations and the entanglements of education and educational technologies, and also of explainable AI, are huge. And this is a big topic to do research on. Let's go along, because I really don't want to stress that point too much. What I want to say, from an educational perspective, explanations provide orientation by not providing a very specific path, but they can give kind of constraints to walk across a path or even deny a path. They reduce, and this is the most optimistic idea, uncertainty, because an explanation should have kind of a very convincing structure. It should be convincing in a very specific way, and they make our society and world inhabitable. And this is something that is not only linked to educational technologies or large language models or specific social contexts. This is basically linked to different social and societal challenges right now, because the world is becoming more and more complex, and we try to reduce complexity by using technologies. However, bringing in the technologies, we raise the complexity, but rather shorten the idea of complexity. And therefore, explanations are crucial as well. Before we go into AI explanations and go to critical computational literacy and what I mean with that, to link it with social XAI, I want to just bring up a brief history about explanations. And this is kind of entangled. I don't want to start a monologue about the Socrates dialogue or the Socratic idea, but it basically started with questions, and the questions are becoming kind of the crucial problem there as well, and they are becoming kind of a historical artifact. So we kind of rely on that, and there's a lot of literature, especially in computer science, on the Socrates dialogue and explainable AI and explaining systems. But it is kind of the timeline that's interesting here, because after that we see kind of, and this is a very short timeline to be honest, the idea of printed books as mediums of explanations. A printed book, especially in scholarly context, is something documenting and something giving from one hand to another. And then we get into the classroom teaching, and there we face situations of classroom settings where the teacher is explaining a very specific subject and a very specific topic. And then we kind of distribute these ideas through digital interfaces. And with large language models, we see this in a very specific sense, since there is kind of the industrialization coming up in a later sense, since the classroom teaching you mentioned in the comment is a picture that I used to do by intention with a slight hint and cue of Audrey Waters' teaching machines. It is kind of industrializing the idea of self-learning and explanations in the context of AI. So we have kind of a very, how to say, kind of a very specific drift from a Socrates dialogue into a very conformist idea of what an explanation could be and how it could efficiently and effectively serve our needs in a very productive sense. It's not about understanding the world in a very broad sense. It's really, really contextualizable and really important to see that we are working with specific explanations, and also performatively that these systems try to explain themselves, and that there is a need for the companies and the concerns to explain their ideas behind of that complex technology, not in order to fulfill the idea of transparency, but in order to make a reasoning again dialogical. And this is not really working quite well, I would say, to be honest, but we can discuss this later on. So what I want to say, and this is a no-brainer, explanations are never just social, not just technical. However, they are not just social, as we saw in this timeline, because the mediums are still there and the media is transporting ideas and explanations. So it's always kind of a mediated communication, but it's not just technical. And this is something that is kind of shifting by focusing on yet another AI model, yet another efficiency step. And therefore, I want to bring in the idea of social explainable AI, which is Katharina Rolfing and colleagues mentioning in a book on social explainable AI that has been published, an edited series that has been published recently. And they place the interaction at the center of their approach to social aspects of explainable AI and propose that it is a means by which an explanation becomes relevant at all. Inspired by social interactions, they define social explainable AI as systems that interactively adapt to users in order to co-construct a satisfying explanation. And this is actually, I mean, a huge dynamic going on when we see the recent success in technological development. And we kind of have that idea of a simulation. And I would rather say it's kind of a simulation to be satisfied by a co-constructed explanation given from a big model or from a big tech company, from a leading tech company that is offering this dialogical interface and sphere in order to reflect upon a concrete explanandum and a concrete problem. So what I want to emphasize here is the co-construction of an explanation. And this is something I think that will be interesting in the next years as well, because the co-construction process is something that is possible, and it was possible before, of course, but it is kind of changing since we have our assistant systems with our smartphones in our pockets, and we can kind of find dialogical situations and can create even audio visual situations that can kind of co-construct explanations, but it is also very fragile because the co-construction process is not only relying on the will to get an information and to become an explanation, but also it is kind of required to support the process of constructing an explanation. And this is not only a technological problem, this is a very social problem when we face time span attentions and when we face doom scrolling problems in other domains, so to say. So when we talk about co-construction and AI explanations, they are not just purely delivered, they are co-constructed in a way that there is a dialogical or a social practice behind it, a dialogical interface, sorry, or a social practice behind it. So it could be people reasoning in a community and talking about the next topic and next series, or maybe the revival of a series from the 80s, and they can basically create something out of it. But it's also about the construction of meaning. And this is what Wolfing and Lim are mentioning. When an explanation is crucial, it becomes meaningful to people. And the meaningfulness is not something that can be kind of standardized in a very specific sense. The meaning is changing, and the meaning is kind of an affordance that needs to be served for the people and for the human idea in general. And therefore, AI explanations are really interesting in whole to understand how they shape and how they kind of give us the idea of being context sensitive while grasping that data. And I mean, the data we are talking about here, the tokens, are actually kind of a very specific economic factor right now, as we see the recent discussions going on and maybe the next future discussions coming up. So what we do is basically, and this is maybe something very out of the box, but maybe not so. Maybe let's just talk about it later on. We are basically creating co-construction workshops within a collaborative research center. And this is first of all from the beginning of the CRC, Carsten Schulte and his team, Michael Lenke, Nils Kloweit, and now from the second phase of the project, Ula Szybelska and I are working on that together with Michael. And we try to work on co-construction workshops that make it experienceable and participatory, reachable to co-construct imaginaries on AI. So what we try to do is we come up with gameful and playful approaches and creative approaches and not patronizing approaches to understand, for example, social bias topics. So we just develop a game that's called the Biased Five, where people are being in a situated role-playing game and have to negotiate as a HR manager how a hiring process influenced by AI is working or even not working. So we put people into these social contexts, into these social situations to shift perspectives and to give them the possibility to think and reconsider what's going on. This is kind of a game series that's going on where people are having the opportunity to not only fulfill their dreams of becoming a HR boss or a tech bro, but also having the chance of discussing a person's perspective that has not been seen and voiced before. So to enable people, giving them a specific voice in a specific topic, and to see how hard it is to find a good common language about these issues when we imagine AI and the opaque systems going on. This is crucial to our work, and this is what we are trying to research on, not only when it comes to, when it comes to explainable AI, but also critical AI literacy. And therefore, we are working on a very participatory approach with you, and we'd like to work with you. So this is an open invitation. I don't know whether you see this very open invitation on the right side of the screen, but feel free to contact us if you want, and feel free to get in touch, because we are really interested in seeing not only very specific given context. For example, we are working with the domains of education, but also medical system, but also NGO and youth institutions. And social work is something that is really interesting for us, because these are the institutions where people are facing challenges and are becoming in trouble, or get into trouble, to focus on these specific issues and find a common language on the topics that are going on. And also we hope to find a way to open up broader discussions on bias, on social issues, but also on the emancipatory power of AI as well. So this is not a one-way direction. This is kind of a vice versa idea we are following here. And we want to step back. We want to step back into not only the classroom, but also into the questions behind of an AI explanation. So what is interesting to us is what counts as evidence for an explanation. I mean, this is really crucial when it comes to fake news generation, to statistical approximation of text generation, and also who benefits from this AI explanation and who's not benefiting at all. So do we also agree in a very specific sense on an explanation? This is, for example, when it comes to the history of sciences, this comes to play when we talk about what's going on right now in a couple of years, and what are the alternatives. So when we talk about educational context or even historical implications of the explanations, with which I opened up with the why question, we think of Ben van Frazen, for example, who is an amazing philosopher on that topic. We see that history is written by narratives, and history is being shaped. And right now we are kind of shaping history and changing parameters and coordinates of something, and this is being reconfigured and revised in a couple of years. So this is super interesting when we talk about this high dynamic of improvement and futuristic visions of AI, also in that humanistic sense. So therefore we are also asking the question, what is actually missing right now? And this question is crucial because we are kind of focused on what we see there, and we are kind of in that content that we are always forced to step back and think of what is actually missing in that very convincing and convenient situations and settings. So this brings up the idea of critical computational literacy. I don't want to bring it up as a contrary project to different projects, but I want to raise a very specific idea of that, which I'm really convinced of. And it is the idea of attitudes first. So when I talk about critical computational literacy and competencies and also skills, we think that it is very important to have a citizen that is able to be in a society and to to be actionable in a society. But what is being shaped right now with the technologies and also with the educational technologies are values, because values are inscribed in the technologies. However, we can discuss it. We can in Europe discuss about GDPR, and we can talk about privacy problems and issues. But as long as the tools are out in the wild, the values are inscribed already, and we have to face these situations. So therefore, critical computational literacy starts with the A, and so the A stands for attitude and the critical stance and the value awareness. And this is not something that can change from one day to another. This is something we here at C3S consider as very important from the beginning on computational literacy. So to gain attitudes and to kind of reflect attitudes and to discuss about attitudes and to gain a critical stance is very crucial. And we see this when we look right now. That can change, of course, but when we look right now into the Scandinavian area, there we see a kind of neglection of digital usage and kind of a very specific movement going on. And we are negotiating the values right now in a very specific sense all across the globe, of course. And we need to be aware that some people are more privileged in that sense, especially in the Northern Hemisphere, than others in that value discussion and value awareness. So this is also something which is kind of shaping the planetary problem in general. What I also want to bring into the composition of critical computational literacy is the aspect of biography. So when we work with digital technologies, when we live, basically, we are kind of making subjective experiences. We explore the world very individualized, being embedded into communities, being in society. Subjectivity and the use of a tool and the givenness of a tool is a very affording question. So it is also changing encounters, and we are facing various encounters, diverse pathways, and therefore the aspect of biographical research combined to educational technologies and digital technologies in general is something that is kind of under the hood of critical computational literacy, how we conceptualize it here. And also the third point is the capacity. So the capacity of analytical, and sorry for the typo, I will fix it and load and reload the slides later on, of analytical understanding of what's going on. It's also kind of a knowledge that you can imagine with computational thinking a bit, but also about computational methods. Nobody maybe needs to be a very specific expert on computational methods, but we need to find an analytical drive to understand what's going on there when words being generated and an output is shining towards our faces on the display. Also, creative approaches and ethical approaches are following this idea of capacity. So if we have the capacity to creatively engage with digital technologies and AI systems, we are able to design maybe not the system at all, but we are maybe able to bring up new contexts and discussions, and we maybe bring up counter movements to that. And therefore, ethical and creative aspects are very much linked to that idea, which I would basically fulfill with the idea of critique. And this is again asking what matters and why. So I started my talk with the why, and I want to end my talk with a why. And this is something I want to kind of propose here, and I'd really be enlightened to discuss that with you. So let's just briefly discuss it right away. And if you want to get in contact with us, feel free to send us an email, send us a message, or just reach out. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dan, for an amazing presentation. Can we all give him a virtual round of applause? Before you leave, though, we're not quite done with you yet. Could you please, if you have time, to fill in our attendee survey? Bonnie will share a link in the chat again. Your feedback's invaluable to us because it'll help us to evaluate and improve these seminars. We're going to take a short break over the summer and we'll resume on the 8th of September when we'll hear from Jean Chao of the Concord Consortium, who will talk about the design and pilot study of a cross-disciplinary AI education module for high school students. So if you'd like to find out more about that, the series, or even previous seminars, you can visit our website. But other than that, have a great morning, afternoon, evening, and thank you so much to Dan and to all of you for coming along to our seminar.